So this is scary. And the Laken Riley Act is not a law that targets criminal illegal immigrants, as many know-nothing political commenters would have you believe if they're talking about this law at all. There will be people who are here legally, who can be caged indefinitely, and then maybe deported based on accusations of crimes they may not have committed. And my heart aches for Laken Riley, a young woman who dreamed of helping people. She wanted to be a nurse, but now whose name will forever be attached to suffering, both now and for years to come.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 311th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Laken Riley Act. The Laken Riley Act is the first new law of the 119th Congress. And after 7 weeks of this new Congress and a full month of the new Trump administration, despite how chaotic and fast the news feels, in Congress, the Laken Riley Act remains the only new law of the 119th Congress. Everything else that's been going on has been done via executive order or has, quite frankly, been done illegally. And so the Laken Riley Act is so far the only thing that's been set in stone by Congress. And so today I'm going to tell you what the new law does, and then we'll examine who's likely to be hurt by it and who is likely to benefit. Because this new law is going to make some people money, and I don't think that is getting highlighted nearly enough. But before we get into it, I would like to remind you that this is a listener-supported podcast. And if you support the show on Patreon, you don't have to hear me say this anymore. And so if you are a freeloader who wants me to stop calling you that, and who also wants access to Last Week in Congress, now is the time to start paying for the show. Last Week in Congress is the video episodes that I'm now producing for people who pay for this show. And in those episodes, I'm telling you what Congress is up to every week. And I am loving producing these episodes, more so than I ever thought that I would. But one of the main reasons is I'm feeling like I am so much more informed. I'm feeling like I am up to date on what is going on in a way that I haven't been in years, because most of the time I have been producing these deep dive episodes and I just get behind. And so that's why I'm doing Last Week in Congress, and I'm finding that the episodes are fun to record because they're entirely unscripted and off the cuff. And the response from our producers has been 100% positive. People are loving these episodes. And so I do think they are worth paying for. And at this point, I am willing to commit to keep doing them for the rest of this Congress. And so to get access to those, you do have to pay on Patreon. Now, right now on Patreon, we are on a per episode model, which means you pay an amount of your choosing for each public episode. And so Last Week in Congress, those episodes are free for everyone on Patreon. But you would pay for this episode. You would pay for the numbered episodes that go out to the public. And in general, I produce 2 numbered public episodes per month. But when you sign up, this is important. I don't want you to use the Apple version of the Patreon app because it's going to cost you a lot more and for no good reason. And the reason is that Apple required Patreon to switch its in-app purchase system starting in November of last year. And the reason is simple greed. Apple wants a cut of my money and a cut of the money that is being made by every other person creating shows and art on Patreon. And so in order to get paid for my work, Apple is charging a fee equal to 30% of what you intend to pledge to support Congressional Dish. But that's only if you sign up using Patreon's Apple app. Now, again, this is only for new subscribers. But if you are intending to sign up for Congressional Dish and you use Apple's Patreon app to sign up to support the show, the way it works out is that, let's say you're going to pay $5 an episode, like the vast majority of our producers do. Instead of getting charged $5 per episode, you would be charged $6.50 an episode. And so that's $13 a month for most months instead of the $10 a month that you're intending to pay me. That also works out to $36 extra per year just for Apple. And they don't deserve that money. Apple has done precisely nothing to help me produce or promote this show. This is just a monopoly charging rent because they can. But we don't have to pay that rent. Instead, if you have an iPhone, use a computer to pledge your support for this show and for any other show you intend to pledge support for on Patreon. This isn't just for Congressional Dish. This is all of Patreon. But it is that easy. To support this show, you just go to patreon.com/congressionaldish on a computer to sign up instead. Then, after creating your account on a computer, then you can download the Apple app to listen on your phone and participate in our Patreon chats and occasional polls, all that stuff. So you can use the Patreon app that is available in the Apple Store, but just don't use it to sign up. Because I have no control over that 30% fee, but you can easily avoid it, and I hope that you do. And so, please support the show. That's how you can do it, and thank you very much. If you are someone who's paying with checks or Zells or PayPals or any of those things, I very much appreciate you too. Okay, so let's get into the law. And it is really unfortunate that this law, which will almost certainly go down in history books as one that causes innocent people to suffer, is named after Laken Riley, who appeared to have been a wonderful human being who was in the process of dedicating her life to helping others. Laken Riley was a 22-year-old nursing student at Augusta University who was beaten to death while jogging on the University of Georgia campus about a year ago in February 2024. The man who was found guilty of killing her was Jose Ibarra, a 26-year-old from Venezuela who crossed into the United States illegally over the southern border near El Paso, Texas in September of 2022. Now, he was caught at the border, but he was then given temporary permission to remain in the United States because Venezuela's government wasn't allowing us to deport people back to Venezuela at the time. Perhaps because we've been trying to overthrow Venezuela's government for years. But regardless of the reasons why, with deportation not an option, the only options left were either temporary release or indefinite detention, aka prison for possibly ever, all expenses paid by our taxes. But at the time, after more than 1 million migrants had arrived at our southern border, we had no prison beds left, and so Jose Ibarra was released. After being granted temporary release into the United States, Jose Ibarra hung out in New York for a while with his family, which included his new wife and her 5-year-old son. While in New York, where he delivered food to lazy people like me, Jose was arrested for riding a scooter without a helmet and with a child, his stepson, who was also not wearing a helmet. Because who wears helmets on scooters? You know, I get that people should for head injury reasons, but they aren't offered out on the street. Like, where do you even get a helmet? I live in downtown Austin, Texas, where scooters are a main method of transportation for residents, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone wear a helmet. And so Jose and his stepson were not wearing helmets, just like everybody else. And so for this, he was not locked in a cage indefinitely, nor shipped to Venezuela. Then a few months later, Jose Ibarra moved to Georgia and into the same apartment complex where his brother was living near the University of Georgia. And soon after moving to Georgia, the brothers were accused of and arrested for shoplifting from a Walmart, although they were never found guilty of it nor convicted. After being arrested, but not proven to have been guilty, Jose was once again neither put into a cage forever nor deported back to Venezuela. And Jose Ibarra was still living in that apartment near the University of Georgia when he attempted to sexually assault Laken Riley, killing her when she put up a fight. That's what a jury concluded happened after being persuaded by the prosecution. And so now Jose Ibarra is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. And this is clearly a tragedy. And Jose Ibarra deserves to be spending the rest of his days behind bars. And this tragedy was used by Republicans, including President Trump, to help them win the 2024 election. In Laken Riley's name, they repeatedly, in locations all over the country, branded immigrants as criminals perpetrating a terrible crime wave across the United States, even though study after study has shown that immigrants, regardless of which immigration documents they have, are far less likely to commit crimes than born and bred here Americans. But in the name of Laken Riley, they demonized immigrants anyway. And then following through on their campaign promises, the Republicans made it their first priority to pass the Laken Riley Act into law. The Laken Riley Act became law on January 29th and is the first significant law of the second round of Trump years. The Laken Riley Act requires the Department of Homeland Security to imprison people who are, quote, charged with, is arrested for, is convicted of, admits having committed or admits committing acts which constitute the essential elements of any burglary, theft, larceny, shoplifting, or assault of a law enforcement officer offense, or any crime that results in death or serious bodily injury to another person, unquote. And that might sound reasonable until you read it closely. Because this new law enables indefinite imprisonment of possibly innocent legal immigrants, followed maybe by deportation. And so let's examine that text a little closer to see exactly how that's true. So first off, this law orders imprisonment with no time limit or bail opportunity for people, quote, arrested for, unquote. Not convicted of, not proven to have committed, but arrested for a list of crimes. And that list of crimes includes some pretty minor offenses, such as the one that Jose Ibarra was arrested for, but not convicted of, which was shoplifting. In his case, shoplifting from the poor owners of Walmart. And in case you don't know, as of this week on the list of the top 20 richest billionaires on this planet, not in the United States, on Earth, members of the Walton family, the Walmart family, are numbers 13, 14, and 17. That's who Jose Ibarra was not proven to have stolen from. That's the unproven crime that is being used to justify this new law. But this isn't really about Jose Ibarra. It's about the future. And now, due to this new law, all that it will take to enable a person to be locked in a cage for an unlimited amount of time or be deported is to be arrested for something. And being arrested is triggered by merely a suspicion or an accusation. There's no proof required to trigger an arrest and to trigger a serious life-altering trauma. Because this is not just for serious crimes. A person can be locked in a cage for being accused of shoplifting. And I've shoplifted on accident before. I, to this day, still have an emergency kit backpack that I accidentally shoplifted from a Home Depot. And it happened because it's a backpack. I put it on while shopping and I paid for everything in my cart, but I forgot that I was wearing the backpack when I walked out of the store. And I only realized that I had it after I had walked home, which was miles away. And should I have taken the time to return it? Yes, I should have, but I just didn't. And if I were here without my proper papers, even saying that to you right now on air would qualify me for unlimited imprisonment or deportation because I, the dangerous criminal shoplifter, quoting from the Laken Riley Act, quote, admits having committed or admits committing acts which constitute the essential elements of a burglary, theft, larceny, shoplifting, unquote. If I were an immigrant, that admission of a minor offense could be enough to allow the Trump administration and any administration after this one to lock me in a cage as long as they want to. And make no mistake, the authority to lock people up who are merely accused is the purpose of this new law, because imprisonment and deportation of immigrants who are proven to have committed crimes, that was already allowed by federal law. The expansion caused by the Laken Riley Act is the expansion to indefinite detention for immigrants, even ones who are here legally, without a conviction for any crime. And so now let's focus for a second on the targets, because it applies to people categorized legally as aliens, which in law means, quote, any person not a citizen or national of the United States, unquote. A citizen is someone who is either born here or got citizenship granting paperwork from the U.S. federal government. A national is someone who has most of the rights of citizenship, but who hasn't formally applied for citizenship. And this is a category mainly for people who were born in U.S. territories, like American Samoa. This is one of those weird legal zones created by the fact that we still have colonies with only partial rights. And listen to our Puerto Rico episodes to learn more about that. But in regards to the Laken Riley Act, the targets are legal aliens. Notice that doesn't limit it to people who arrived here illegally. This applies to legal immigrants, such as asylum seekers, who are people who show up at our border and are allowed by law to ask for asylum. Under our current laws, a person who believes that they are in mortal danger in their home country can apply to stay here, and they are legally allowed to be here while they wait for a court date to hear their case. And as we have heard testified to in Congress for years, one of the main problems with our current asylum system is that we have more people arriving than we have judges and courtrooms available to process them all. And now there is a line that is over 1 million people deep. And so asylum seekers are coming here, asking for their place in line, and then paroled, meaning they're temporarily allowed to go start their life here while they wait for years for their court date, which is a situation that has been caused by us, by our country's refusal to hire enough judges to do the job. And go back and listen to the episode that I produced right before the election about the immigration bills from the last Congress. I read the House Republican wet dream bill that passed with no, or at least damn near no, Democratic Party support. And I read the bipartisan Senate immigration bill, which actually had a chance of becoming law if it weren't for stupid politics. But policy-wise, if you heard that episode, you know that both of those bills were all about changing our asylum system. Neither of them were about illegal immigration, although you wouldn't understand that from the endless bullshit spewed during the campaigns. The real policy debate in Congress is all about legal immigration. It's all about asylum seekers. And there's a good reason for that. Our asylum system doesn't make a lot of sense, and it is easy to abuse. Like, if I weren't from here and I just wanted to come to the US to hang out, I could either try and get a residency visa, which is severely limited. It is stupid hard to get. Or I could say that I'm afraid of something in my home country and get to stay here for like 3 years while I wait for a court date. Doing that's like getting a 3-year visa. The loophole is as obvious as it gets. But the fact is that our stupid system is what it is, and every single person who claims asylum and waits for a court date is following our laws. They are here legally. And speaking of legal immigrants, the Laken Riley Act also applies to so-called dreamers, who are people whose parents brought them here without proper papers as young children. These are people who have been Americans in every way except on paper their entire lives. But because they don't have the documents due to the decisions of their parents, an accusation of shoplifting, an unproven accusation, could result in that person being locked in a cage for as long as the Trump administration wants, and maybe even shipped to a country they've never lived in, where they don't speak the language, where they don't know anyone, and then be prohibited from ever coming home. The Laken Riley Act is a recipe for horrific injustices and traumas against people who don't deserve it. And huge red flag, on the day this law was signed, President Trump also signed an executive order requiring Guantanamo Bay Prison, the same prison where we have locked up a few dozen humans who have been convicted of nothing for more than 20 years. Well, that prison is being ordered to be filled to capacity with criminal aliens. The Trump administration is arguing in legal challenges that it has the right to keep immigrants in Guantanamo Bay Prison for longer than 6 months. So this is scary. And the Laken Riley Act is not a law that targets criminal illegal immigrants, as many know-nothing political commenters would have you believe if they're talking about this law at all. There will be people who are here legally, who can be caged indefinitely, and then maybe deported based on accusations of crimes they may not have committed. And my heart aches for Laken Riley, a young woman who dreamed of helping people. She wanted to be a nurse, but now whose name will forever be attached to suffering both now and for years to come. And so today, for most of the rest of this episode, we're going to focus on the imprisonment part of the Laken Riley Act, because the focus in this country on this issue seems to be the deportations, and the imprisonment is being treated like it's just a stepping stone to that end. But I don't think so. There's too much money being made in the business of caging humans in the United States, and too many plans for expansions of that business. I see the Laken Riley Act as a pipeline to prison, and so today we're going to follow the money and see why that might be a motivation for this new law. But real quick, I do want to tell you what's in the rest of the law just to get this out of the way and make sure you're fully informed. And so the second part of the law is that it also gives state attorneys general the right to sue the U.S. Attorney General or the Homeland Security Secretary if an immigrant who could have been caged but was not, someone like Jose Ibarra, who was not caged indefinitely when accused of shoplifting from a Walmart. Well, when someone like that commits a maybe crime of that magnitude, which costs anyone in that state, like Walmart, $100 or more, in those instances, the state can sue the feds for failing to cage that human indefinitely when they could have, guilty or not. And immigration experts see this as a way to let governors, like Greg Abbott of Texas, and their state attorney generals, like Ken Paxton of Texas, dictate federal immigrant detention policies in times when immigrant haters like Donald Trump are no longer in charge of the federal government. And politically, you can blame the Republican Party for this in its entirety. And reminder, when I say things like that, I am talking about empowered Republicans in Congress and in the presidency, not Republican voters, who I'm not entirely excusing here, but I do have to say that after spending time at the Republican National Convention with the most dedicated Republican Party supporters, I am more convinced than ever that many Republican voters have absolutely no idea what the Republican Party actually stands for and does when in power, or that it's not really about politics for them and they don't really care. Which, as the buyer's remorse we're starting to witness in this country might testify to, as Trump cuts national park staff and disaster recovery staff and lays off thousands of people in blue and in red states. You know, what I think happened here is that the Republicans built a community, a fun community, with fun parties. The Trump rallies were fun, but I don't think for a lot of them it was about governing. You know, it's amazing to see Republican normies shift their views to match what their team was and is now chanting. So like Republicans, for decades, who used to repeat free trade and free enterprise, are now all gung-ho for tariffs. And Republicans, like the ones I met at the RNC, who were wearing giant crucifixes around their necks because look how Christian I am, were also making excuses for their dear leader who was cheating on his wives and fucking porn stars. What I see going on here in the United States is that many Republicans seem to have picked a team. They are Team Republican the same way I'm Team Red Sox, and they are defending it and supporting it no matter what they do. And I feel like that's fine in something frivolous like sports. But politics and sports are not the same. Politics have real-life consequences. And supporting a team is not a way of voting and governing that I respect at all. But if you are wondering how I think we got here, this is how. And if you can't see this pattern among Republican supporters whose policies are all over the place but loyalty's steadfast, well, then you're probably one of them. And at this point, I just feel bad for you because I think guilt is one of the toughest feelings to deal with. And eventually, as the pain of the Trump decisions start to really be felt around this country and felt around the world, I don't envy the guilt that Republican voters are going to feel if you're not feeling it already. I was a Republican who used my first vote to empower George W. Bush. It's a vote I cast because my parents were Republicans. My parents were Republicans just like they're Red Sox fans. And so I voted with my team. And I didn't realize that my team would torture people and send my friends to die in an unnecessary war. And so I know how the guilt feels. I still feel that guilt to this day. But I'm glad that I let myself feel it. I'm glad that I didn't dig in my heels and bend my vision for the world to fit the team narrative just so I could avoid the guilt. That guilt is still driving me to do this work today. It changed my life for the better, even though the process of admitting that I did something wrong with my vote and seeing the consequences, it was really hard. And I hope that if someone listening to this show finds themselves going through it, that you would feel safe talking to me, because I do get it. And I don't intend to ever be mean to you. We don't know what we don't know until we know. And so I'm welcoming people into the realm of the politically homeless with love and open arms. And I hope others will do the same. But back to the Laken Riley Act and the pain that this law is guaranteed to cause. The empowered Republicans in Congress, they knew damn well what they were doing in policy. And they used that fun MAGA community to win votes so that they could enact this policy. And every single House Republican voted yes, as did every Republican senator. But here's why I'm politically homeless. So did 46 Democrats in the House and 11 Democrats in the Senate. And those 11 Senate Democrat votes were critical. The final vote in the Senate was 64-35, which is a filibuster-proof majority, which means that those 11 Democrats chose not to put up a roadblock that they did have in their power to stop this thing. Put another way, the Laken Riley Act could not be law without Democratic Party complicity, and they will partially own whatever injustices arise because of it. Because members of their own party were sounding the alarm. It was no secret in Congress what this bill would do. Here's Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland. He's a professor of constitutional law, and here he is speaking in the House Rules Committee before the votes were taken.
This bill would expand the scope of mandatory immigration detention, going from the compulsory detention of any undocumented immigrant who is convicted of an act of theft, serious violent crime, larceny, or shoplifting, to the compulsory detention of any such person simply charged with or even just arrested for such an offense, even if they are never charged with or convicted of a criminal offense at all. This is a huge departure from current law, which since 1996 has only required mandatory detention for those who are criminally convicted or who admit to having committed certain crimes. That is, when criminal guilt is certain. It's important to note that the government already, as my friend acknowledges, has discretionary authority to detain any and all undocumented immigrants facing deportation. So this bill would actually take away the executive's discretion to detain those who are most dangerous or most likely to flee.
The Democrats knew the consequences, and they let this become law even though they had the power to stop it. But now it's law. And as you now know, imprisonment is required with the changes made. Imprisonment is the goal. And so the question becomes, cui bono? Who benefits? Who benefits from putting humans in prisons? Well, it's more people than you might think. First of all, it's the prisons themselves, because some prisons themselves are for profit. You see, private for-profit prisons were not even a thing before the 1980s. Until about 1983, all prisons in the United States were owned and operated by the government, as caging humans and rehabilitating them for release back into our society was considered an essential government service. But in 1983, during the privatization-obsessed Reagan administration, which had launched the war on drugs and ballooned our prison population beyond its capacity, seeing an opportunity for profit, the Corrections Corporation of America, now known as CoreCivic, was invented. In 1984, CoreCivic opened our nation's first for-profit prison in, surprise, surprise, the state of Texas, where a motel was renovated to cage immigrants. Interestingly, there has never been a federal law written and passed by Congress authorizing the full privatization of prisons. Essentially, existing authorities that were used traditionally to contract prison services like laundry were just expanded to privatize the whole damn facility. Now, in more recent times, the Biden administration issued an executive order in January 2021, directing the Department of Justice to phase out its contracts with private prison companies. But that only applied to federal prisons. It didn't touch the states. And importantly, and this is a key detail always left out by Biden-Harris supporters, the executive order excluded Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention from the order. And so in reality, due to that massive loophole that continued to allow the caging of immigrants for profit, the Biden administration actually increased the private prison population. In January of 2021, when President Biden took office, Immigration and Customs Enforcement held an average of 15,444 people in detention each day. In July of 2023, Immigration and Customs Enforcement was detaining on average 30,000 people each day, which is about double, and most of those were held in private for-profit prisons. Because the percentage of immigrants in profitable prisons increased too. In 2021, during Biden's first year in office, about 80% of immigrant prisoners were held in private for-profit prisons. By the end of Biden's reign, 90% of immigrant prisoners were being held in a cage for profit. But even this wasn't enough for President Donald Trump, who killed the Biden executive order on his first day in office. And so allowing people to profit off of denying humans their freedoms is a bipartisan policy choice here in the United States. And one of the many problems with that policy choice, aside from the obvious ethical problems, with for-profit prisons is that the profit model encourages the prison operators to cut corners for savings, which can then be pocketed by shareholders. Private prisons have consistently been found to serve cheaper, less nutritious food. They staff fewer guards and pay them less than government prison guards, which helps explain why the Department of Justice's Inspector General has reported that private prisons are more dangerous than public prisons. Private prisons are also known to operate short on healthcare staff, which is dangerous to the caged humans as well. And much of the staffing, groundskeepers, janitors, food servers, etc., are the prisoners themselves, who are often paid so little that it barely even counts as being paid. We're talking like 10 cents an hour. And the private prison company gets to pass out the savings, the amount between the minimum wage and the slave wage, to their shareholders. And you might be wondering, how is any of this allowed? Well, there was a hearing about prison labor that took place in the Senate Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on Criminal Justice and Counterterrorism, last May in 2024. And during that hearing, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey provided some answers.
Most Americans really are shocked that they learn that the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery in our country, excludes incarcerated people. It's called the Exception Clause, which was approved by our very Senate Judiciary Committee in 1864. The language of the Exception Clause lives on not only in our federal Constitution, but also in 16 state constitutions.
And then later in the hearing, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas followed up on the 13th Amendment with Jennifer Turner, who is the principal human rights researcher at the American Civil Liberties Union.
Ms. Turner, in your opening statement, you called the so-called Exception Clause of the 13th Amendment a gaping loophole. Do you believe that is a loophole?
I do. It is the foundation of prison labor programs today, and it led to the labor programs we have today that we truly have forced labor.
So you think a loophole implies it was unintended or accidental or omission? You think the people who drafted the 13th Amendment and ratified it didn't know what they were doing?
Oh, I think it was absolutely intentional, and it allowed for the use of incarcerated people to replace this free labor force provided by chattel slavery. And we saw it in some states, for instance, in Texas, following the passage of the 13th Amendment. The state of Texas purchased 10 plantations and began running them as prisons, some of which still run today.
So did prisons use labor before the 13th Amendment was passed?
Yes.
So it was just continuing a longstanding practice. It wasn't replacing anything.
It expanded. It allowed for the expansion of prison labor programs, and in fact became so lucrative that it led to passage of laws such as the Black Codes that encouraged the reincarceration of Black men on specious charges to continue to work in prisons and to provide profit for prisons both in the North and in the South.
So it's your testimony that we need to have a constitutional amendment to repeal that clause?
Yes, there's no place for forced labor in the United States.
And so that's how private prisons are able to force the people they cage to do work for them for little to no money. then pocket the money that they would have to pay for those services without this legal loophole and pass the stolen wages out to shareholders. And it is clear that, like much of our economy, let's be clear, that who benefits from private prisons are shareholders, who are people who are already wealthy enough to be able to buy into the stock market racket. Just as a reminder, about 40% of Americans own no stock at all. And so 40% of us have to pay the extra costs that get funneled into shareholder pockets and don't benefit from the economy being structured like this at all. And as of 2023, the top 10% of Americans owned 93% of all stocks. And so the benefits are clearly going to the wealthiest among us. The stock market is the wealth transfer mechanism that is facilitating the growing inequality in our society. And private prisons are a part of that. As for the companies and shareholders who are profiting the most from the privatization of prisons, the OG private prison corporation, CoreCivic, remains the largest private prison corporation in the United States. As of 2023, it had enough capacity to cage over 65,000 human beings for profit, and about 30% of those beds are reserved for immigrants caged by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And the CoreCivic shareholders are so excited about the Trump administration. So here's Damon Hindinger, the CEO of CoreCivic, who makes about half of his money in stock and who already owns approximately 788,266 shares of CoreCivic stock, which is currently worth about $15 million. Here he is on a call with his fellow giddy investors in early February 2025.
So let me start with this. I've worked at CoreCivic for 32 years, and this is truly one of the most exciting periods in my career with the company. Having just wrapped up a strong 2024, we're anticipating significant growth opportunities, perhaps the most significant growth in our company's history over the next several years. We believe CoreCivic is exceptionally well-positioned operationally and financially to meet what we expect to be a sharp acceleration in demand from our partners, particularly our key federal partners, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and the United States Marshal Service. The change in presidential administration on January 20th has ushered in significant policy and legislative changes that directly impact our business.
And it's not surprising that CoreCivic's bigwig shareholders would be excited about this new administration. After all, they helped buy Donald Trump and other Republicans their power. Because people affiliated with CoreCivic passed out more than $760,000 in legal bribes, also known as campaign contributions, to help politicians win the 2024 election, with damn near all of that money going to Republicans. On top of that, CoreCivic has consistently spent over $1 million per year lobbying Congress. During the 118th Congress, CoreCivic spent more than $1.6 million on 11 lobbyists in 2023, including former Democratic member of Congress Albert Wynn. And they spent more than $1.7 million on 10 lobbyists to troll the halls of Congress in 2024. And what does lobbying like that get you? Well, in episode 302 about the border bills, we discovered that the Republican wet dream immigration bill had a provision in it that would have forced the reopening of the South Texas Family Residential Center. That was a CoreCivic private prison that the Republicans were trying to force back into existence. This is what lobbying money buys. And while we're at it, let's take a quick look at GEO Group, the second largest private prison corporation in the United States, who, fun fact, our new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, used to be a lobbyist for. GEO Group spent similar amounts on influence peddling as CoreCivic did, over $1 million per year during both years of the 118th Congress. They spent more than $1.2 million in 2023 and more than $1.3 million in 2024, paying 13 lobbyists, including someone longtime listeners of Congressional Dish might even remember, former Republican Representative Martha Roby of Alabama. Now, she's someone that I used to use as an example of someone who I disagreed with often politically, but after watching Congress for so long, she seemed like someone who just seemed like a nice lady who I could see myself baking cookies with and having a lovely time. But now she's making bank. $240,000 in the 118th Congress from GEO Group alone, convincing her former co-workers in Congress to craft legislation to allow more humans to be caged for profit. And I don't think I want to make cookies with Martha Roby anymore. But where GEO Group affiliates set themselves apart from CoreCivic affiliates were in their legal bribes, in their campaign contributions, passing out a total of more than $3.4 million to politicians and their political action committees for the 2024 election. A full $1 million of that went to the Make America Great Again, Inc., and I'll let you guess who benefited from that one. But in total, the vast majority of GEO Group's $3.4 million in legal bribes went to Republicans. And so when the Republicans took over our government, they immediately went to work expanding the private prison business. And I mean immediately. On January 20th, the day he took office, President Trump signed an executive order that reversed President Biden's executive order that prevented the Department of Justice from contracting with private prisons, albeit with that massive loophole that still allowed private prisons to cage immigrants. But Donald Trump reversed even those restrictions on federal contracts for criminal prisoner prisons on day one. Although I can't give you the details of that executive order because for some reason, the Trump administration still hasn't released the text of it to the public. But also on his first day of office, Donald Trump signed at least a half a dozen executive orders related to immigration, including one that expands the number of cages we need to pay for to lock up immigrants in, another removing protections for certain immigrants, and he declared a fake emergency at the southern border that authorized the military to join Border Patrol, along with other tough-on-immigrant orders. And all of these are likely to result in increases of human beings being put in cages on our dime, a portion of that dime that will end up in private prison shareholder accounts. And then, of course, when the Republicans took control of Congress, the first thing they did, the only thing they've done, is pass the Laken Riley Act into law. But what I don't think a lot of us realize is that shareholders are not just profiting from private for-profit prisons, which are the most obvious profit-making scheme in the business of caging humans. Because like convicted criminals, whether they're immigrants like Jose Ibarra or born-here Americans, they often end up in federal pound-you-in-the-ass prisons, and their caging makes people money too. Big money is being made in government prisons too, where the prisons themselves are not privatized. And one of the biggest beneficiaries of the profiting in government prisons is the federal government itself. So here's Jennifer Turner. She's the principal human rights researcher at the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. And here she is testifying last May.
Today, our nation incarcerates over 1.2 million people in state and federal prisons, and 2 out of 3 of these incarcerated people are also workers. In most instances, the jobs these people in prisons have look similar to those of millions of people working on the outside. They work as cooks, janitors, and groundskeepers, or in laundries and factories. Outside the prison walls, incarcerated people provide vital public services such as repairing roads, fighting wildfires, or clearing debris after hurricanes. They cultivate and harvest crops, some on penal plantations situated on land that was originally the site of slave plantations. But there are 2 crucial differences. Incarcerated workers are under the complete control of their employers, and they've been stripped of even the most minimal protections against labor exploitation and abuse. From the moment they enter the prison gates, they can be forced to work. More than 76% of incarcerated workers report that they're required to work or face additional punishment such as solitary confinement, denial of opportunities to reduce their sentence, and loss of family visitation. Illness, injury, disability, or physical inability to work often does not relieve them of work duties. U.S. law explicitly excludes incarcerated workers from the most universally recognized workplace protections, including health and safety laws. Incarcerated people sometimes work in dangerous industrial settings or hazardous conditions that would be closely regulated and monitored if they were not incarcerated. Workers are assigned work in unsafe conditions without the standard training or protective gear provided in workplaces outside prisons. In numerous cases we documented nationwide, serious injuries and deaths could have been prevented with proper training, machine guarding mechanisms, or personal protective equipment. Incarcerated workers are not covered by minimum wage laws and are paid on average 13 to 52 cents per hour in non-industry jobs. More than 80% have maintenance jobs that support the operation of the prison facilities and are compensated at the lower end of prison pay scales. In 7 states, incarcerated people are paid nothing at all for most jobs. Even if an incarcerated worker earns pennies, these low wages are not theirs to keep. Across the country, prisons deduct as much as 80% from incarcerated people's paychecks for room and board and legal financial obligations. In the federal prison system, 59% of the wages earned by incarcerated workers employed in the Federal Prison Industries Program was deducted by the federal government. Prison systems charge incarcerated people exorbitant costs for basic necessities like phone calls home, decent food, hygiene products, and medical care. Families, many of whom are impoverished themselves, spend an estimated $2.9 billion a year on commissary accounts and phone calls. Over half of these families are forced to go into debt to afford the costs of a relative's conviction and subsequent incarceration. However, someone is profiting in the American prison system. Incarcerated workers produce real profits for state prisons and state governments, the primary beneficiaries of forced prison labor. Nationally, incarcerated workers produce more than $2 billion a year in goods and commodities and over $9 billion a year in services for the maintenance of the prisons where they're warehoused. The captive labor system of American prisons hides the staggering cost of our country's bloated prison system.
Now, from the government's view of things, from society's view, there are good reasons for having prisoners work. So here's Charles Lehman. He's a professional researcher at the Manhattan Institute.
Policymakers, therefore, should prioritize making offenders employable. Few interventions are as obvious for this purpose as giving people jobs in prison. Evidence supports this approach. One analysis of 77,000 Indiana and Tennessee prisoners employed by private firms found that participation in prison work is associated with significant reductions in recidivism at the 1- and 2-year marks compared to a matched control group. Another, following a cohort of 6,000 offenders released in Minnesota, found that those who worked were 24% more likely than controls to find a job, worked more hours, and had higher total wages, and the number of hours working was significantly associated with lower recidivism rates. There's also benefit to prisoners working outside the prison walls. Evidence suggests that work release, prisoners being moved to low-security facilities and being allowed out to work during the day, improves employment outcomes and reduces recidivism for property but not violent offenses.
And sorry that cut off there. He said, but not for violent offenses. But the point is that when done correctly, prisoner work programs can be hugely beneficial to both society and for the prisoners. And here's a beautiful example. Here's Senator Alex Padilla of California speaking to Andrea Armstrong. She's a professor of law at the Loyola University College of Law. And this conversation took place 8 months before the wildfires burned down the Pacific Palisades in Altadena in California, which are fires that would have been much worse if not for the heroic firefighters who put the fires out as fast as they could once the winds died down. And here's how some of those heroes were trained.
To help address the growing wildfire threat facing California, we have long relied on the Conservation Camp Program, which is our State Department of Corrections volunteer firefighting program. The incarcerated individuals who volunteer to join the Conservation Camp Program have at times comprised up to 40% of the state's total firefighting force. So it's not insignificant. And I do want to make it a point to emphasize the voluntary nature of this program. It's voluntary, but so attractive that we've often see waiting lists for incarcerated individuals who want to participate in the program. Now, many participants in California's firefighting program have described the experience as valuable for building real-life skills. And more than 300 formerly incarcerated firefighters have used these qualifications and actual certification. So it's not just the skills, the training, and the experience, but certification to go on to earn a job with CAL FIRE, the state's firefighting force. I think this program can serve as a model for how we help incarcerated individuals develop useful skills and the necessary certifications to help them find meaningful, well-paying work post-release. My first question is for Ms. Armstrong. How can we build on this model in California to help establish clear links between prison labor work and opportunities for employment post-release?
One of the most significant features, I believe, of the California system is the fact that legal roadblocks to people serving as firefighters upon release were removed. Right? And so when we think about what happens behind bars, the things that people are trained for, it is also just as important to look at, are there barriers to them assuming those professions and vocations after the fact?
And so having prisoners work can be a really good thing, and not just for society, but also for the prisoner. But it's super important for the skills to translate to the real world.
I think there's a lot of scenarios in which work can actually be something that is valuable and also can help create order and security within a facility. I think what's really interesting is in my audits and visits behind the wire, people actually do not want to sit in their cell for 23 hours a day by themselves. That is not what they want to do. Instead, the program that is the most oversubscribed at Angola is the one where they are training dogs to be helping dogs to assist folks with disabilities who might need additional work and assistance. So I think when we think about labor behind bars, one line that I would draw is there the possibility of that person being able to apply for a job, to be able to have some agency or choice in which job they are training for or learning, and then thinking about the connections between that and the market outside, as Mr. Lehman talked about.
But in many cases in the United States, the jobs that prisoners are doing are not designed to help them rejoin the real world. Here's Jennifer Turner. She's the principal human rights researcher at the ACLU.
But the reality is that state licensing restrictions bar many formerly incarcerated people from engaging in work directly related to the work that they learned and took on while incarcerated. And these state licensing restrictions often aren't related to their crime of conviction. It's one thing to say you can't be involved as an accountant if you have a white-collar embezzling conviction, for instance. But someone who's worked as a hospice aide in prison, who's worked for years tending to dying and sick incarcerated people, may be barred in many states from obtaining work as home health care aides or hospice nurses. And that's a problem as well. And while we look to the solutions that ensure people can succeed when they reintegrate into their families and their communities, we also have to consider ending these barriers to employment for people after they're released.
And so there are instances where having prisoners work is mutually beneficial for the government and the prisoner, and even a business if that business is training the person for a job that person is then legally allowed to perform after release. But not every state is structuring even their firefighting programs like California. So here's an example from Jennifer Turner, again, the researcher from the ACLU.
And I just wanted to add, California is not alone in using incarcerated workers to fight wildfires. It's one of at least 14 states that does so, and not all these programs are fully voluntary, and we have seen serious injuries and deaths result from this work, both for non-incarcerated and incarcerated workers. But when people are desperate to support themselves and need to support themselves while incarcerated and facing legal financial obligations, that $1 an hour, for instance, in California, is a very powerful incentive. And we see some states truly rely on incarcerated workers to perform this work, including, for instance, Georgia. 1/3 of counties rely on incarcerated firefighters to respond to motor vehicle accidents, wildfires, and house fires. And these workers are not paid a cent for their work.
And so some governments are just simply saving money by forcing prisoners to do government jobs like firefighting and not paying them anything at all. That's simply exploitation. And it goes far beyond firefighting. So take Unicor, for example. Unicor is a federal government corporation that sells products produced by prisoners, including office furniture, mattresses, heavy equipment, electronics, clothes, and more. The prisoners also provide services like operating call centers and making signs and operating data networks. You can check out they have a whole website telling you everything that these prisoners make. Now, a lot of these products and services are bought by the government itself because you and I aren't able to buy these products directly. But the Unicor website also advertises that private sector companies can contact Unicor and get their own products made by the prisoners. Unicor is advertising that, quote, commercial entities can now explore competitive bids and higher profits through our high-quality, competitively priced labor, unquote. So Unicorn is basically selling slave wages to the private sector, to the for-profit sector. And there's also like a whole for-profit company that operates on prison labor called Prison Blues, which sells denim products, all of which are produced by prisoners who make between $120 and $150 per month. And even though they pay that poorly, the products are not very cheap. The jeans are at least $50. The shirts are between $45 and $120. And they even sell like Native American themed greeting cards for $2 to $4 each. And all of this is sold directly to the public for profit. And on top of that, there are also many multinational, immensely profitable corporations that are using prisoners being paid slave wages as well. According to a report published just 2 months ago in December 2024, in Alabama, where this is extremely common, over 500 businesses, including McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, Budweiser, Walmart, and many others, have prisoners working in their stores and or have prisoners making their products behind the prison walls. And while many prisoners do technically make minimum wage, the government confiscates about 40% of that and charges fees to the prisoners for things like rides to their jobs and for laundry services. And that's just in one state. And many of these jobs are simply paths to nowhere for the prisoners. Here's Jennifer Turner of the ACLU.
The reality is that many, even of our vocational programs, are in areas of work that are declining. Legislative oversight of prison industries programs in Texas and Mississippi, for instance, found that they were training people in jobs that are little to no job prospects, such as garment industry manufacturing or farm work.
And so the whole point of those types of work programs is not to benefit the prisoner after he or she is released, but to allow the government and private companies to save money on labor costs. It's pure exploitation. Here's Charles Lehman. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which basically means he's a researcher, answering questions posed by Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas.
If prisons were forced to pay inmates those higher wages, probably a lot higher than what the current minimum wage is, given other Democratic proposals, who is ultimately going to be paying for those higher wages?
In contexts where they're employed by the state or other public entities, the taxpayer ultimately funds those public entities. If they're employed indirectly by private employers, then the people who are paying for those private employers, but that makes their labor much less competitive in that context.
Competitive labor. That's the goal. And so in non-corporate speak, slave wages. That's the goal. And even though it sounds like this is good for the taxpayers, like we're saving money, in reality, it seems like a dumb goal for society. You have to think bigger than that. Here's Jennifer Turner of the ACLU.
Their economic analysis by Edgeworth Economics and Worth Rises shows there's a true fiscal argument for paying incarcerated workers minimum wage. To pay them a fair wage would actually generate revenue over the long term, and it would benefit victims of crime who would be paid victim restitution. Currently, incarcerated people are saddled with debts for victim restitution they're unable to pay back. When they're released from prison, maintain those debts and struggle to pay them back. If incarcerated workers are paid a minimum wage, they'll be able to pay restitution that will put money in the hands of victims of crime. It will also allow them to pay child support and support their families who are currently going into debt to support their loved one while they're incarcerated. It will allow incarcerated people to become self-sufficient and to have some savings to set them up for success upon release. Studies do show that some savings upon release sets people up for reduced success and reduces recidivism, allows them to gain stable housing, stable employment. That there, in addition, generates tax revenue when this income is taxed.
And so if these work programs in private and public prisons were about the prisoner, those arguments would be taken into account, even for immigrants. Because if we are going to send someone to another country, it would also be good for them to have some cash in their pocket, especially cash that they earned. But the reality is, in this country, the exploitation is a feature, not a bug. The profit is a feature, not a bug. And here we have the Laken Riley Act and the required imprisonment of people, 90% of whom, according to recent trends, we know will be in for-profit prisons. Their imprisonment is the point. That's all that's needed for that kind of profit. But some of these people will end up in government prisons, 10% or so, maybe more of them, because we don't really know yet where all the new cages are going to be. But the full capacity cages at Guantanamo Bay, that's a public prison. And the prisoners are forced to work in public prisons, as we now know. Will their work be for the benefit of the federal government, which saves money on their forced labor, which is a monstrous proposition when we're talking about people who are here legally, who have committed no crimes? Or will they be working for private companies, which pocket the money that they would have paid via minimum wages to non-caged humans? Do we really think that with that many people profiting, especially in the for-profit sector, that this isn't a motivation behind increasing our prison population in general, behind requiring more people to be caged, whether they've been convicted of a crime or not? And so going forward, when it comes to these immigrants or legal immigrants, there will be a lot of focus on deportations, and rightfully so. But let's remember what is happening between the capture of an immigrant, all of whom seem to be branded as illegal lately, whether they are or not. I must say that journalists and pundits are being very careless with their words on this subject. But let's not lose sight of the imprisonment part of their process. How long are these people being kept in cages? And what are these human beings being forced to do while in those cages? And who's benefiting? Because our country has a shameful history of imprisonments without cause and without end. It's been going on for a long time, from the internment of the Japanese in World War II to the George W. Bush imprisonments, which those people are still being held in Guantanamo Bay. And I think we are entering another one of our shameful eras due to the Laken Riley Act, because I think it's inevitable that innocent people will be locked up and shipped away using this new law. And when those outrages are exposed, it's important to know what to lobby for. And so the repeal of the Laken Riley Act should be on our list, or at least the parts of it that require the imprisonment of people who have simply been arrested. Convictions should be required again. And we should remember this shameful law, named after a beautiful person, so that someday we can make it go away. So today I am very happy to let you know that we have 3 new executive producers, although some of these people are not first-time executive producers, but are adding credits to there is a distinguished list of executive producer credits for Congressional Dish. And if you're not aware, executive producers are people that pay at least $535 for this podcast. And every time you do that, every time you hit $535, you get to put an executive producer credit on an episode of your choice. This lends your vouch to that episode as one of the most valuable, and in doing so, it moves that episode up our most valuable episodes list, which is where I send every new person when they want to know where to start, because we now have a back catalog that goes back 12 years. And so it's actually our producers who are determining what are the episodes that new people should listen to first. And so first, I would like to thank Corey Cameron, who is now an executive producer on episode 270, The Twitter Files. I'd also like to thank Sean Newman, who is now an executive producer on episode 305, called Freaky Foods. And I'd also like to thank Tara Astor, who is now an executive producer on episode 298, called Drafting World War III. And Tara sent in a message along with her executive producer credit. She said about Drafting World War III, quote, "It only has 2 executive producers, and my contribution will bump it up to number 3 category. I am deeply anti-war and very much appreciate this episode. My name is Tara Astor from Mount Holly, New Jersey. I discovered Congressional Dish when Jen did a guest appearance with David Dayen on Brianna Joy Gray's podcast Bad Faith back in April 2021. I've been a fan and contributor ever since. I rely on Jen to keep up with what is happening in Congress. She is right up there with Glenn Greenwald as my go-to people for staying informed. Please keep up the great work." And I love all of those name drops. I am very, very proud to be in any kind of conversation with Brianna Joy Gray, David Dayen, and Glenn Greenwald. So thank you so much. That's a beautiful compliment. And when it comes to the episode Drafting World War III, I do think that's a really, really important one to listen to right now, as we have a president of the United States who is threatening to take over, let's see, what's the list? Gaza, Panama Canal, Greenland, and Canada. And so you should probably know that our Congress is openly discussing now the need for possibly bringing back the draft. And you can hear the footage straight from Congress in episode 298. So that's a really important one. And so updating where we are in the most valuable episodes, I do want to let you know that we have a number 1 now that has kicked Contriving January 6th out of the number 1 spot. It was there for a very long time. But our number 1 now is War Money. And I kind of regret calling it that, because that is actually the episode where you learn about the history of Israel. So War Money is now number 1. It has 7 executive producers. Contriving January 6th, which is the summary of all 20 hours of the January 6th committee hearings, that is now number 2 with 6 executive producers. And then our number 3 most valuable episode is WTF is the Federal Reserve. It's an oldie but a goodie. And that has 5 executive producers. And so with the EP credits that we just put on these 3 episodes, the Twitter Files now has 2 executive producers, but that still keeps it on the 2nd page. So if people want the Twitter Files to move up, we do need a 3rd executive producer to give that a chance to be seen on page 1. Freaky Foods, that executive producer credit, does now give it 3 executive producer credits, which it should put it in the 6th most valuable episode spot. And Drafting World War III also has 3 executive producer credits, and that should make it number 7 on the list. Because the way we have it automatically done is that newer episodes move up higher when there's a tie. And so Freaky Foods is a newer episode than Drafting World War III. That's why Freaky Foods is number 6 and Drafting World War III is number 7. It has nothing to do with the importance. I think they're both important episodes. But right now, with Trump being all, let's take over our allies, I think it's an important time to understand what Congress is talking about when it comes to matters of war. Okay, as you might be able to hear, I am losing my voice fast. I got hit so hard with a really nasty sinus infection. That is why this episode is later than I intended. I intended to have this out a week ago, but I could barely talk. And so I'm losing my ability to speak. And so I'm going to wrap this up. But if you want to hear more from me, please support the show on Patreon, where you can hear Last Week in Congress. I'm putting out the beginning of every week when Congress is in session. So yeah, thanks for supporting the show. If you are, if you're not, please step up. We need you. And I will talk to you very soon. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. With the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.